Marcus Thompson adjusted his camera strap as he stepped off the tour bus in front of Buckingham Palace. The 28-year-old American had saved for 3 years to afford this trip to London, and he was determined to capture every moment. His social media followers back in Denver were expecting daily updates from his European adventure, and Marcus knew that content was king in the influencer game. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as tourists gathered behind the metal barriers. Marcus pushed his way through the crowd, his expensive camera equipment marking him as someone serious about photography. He had watched countless YouTube videos about the famous changing of the guard ceremony, but seeing it in person was something entirely different. The first thing that struck him was the absolute stillness of the guards. These weren't actors in costumes putting on a show for tourists. These were real soldiers, members of the elite regiments that protected the royal family. Their red tunics were immaculate, their bearskin hats perfectly positioned, and their rifles held with military precision that spoke of years of training. Marcus began snapping photos, moving along the barrier to get different angles. The tourists around him were doing the same thing, but most were using phones or simple cameras. Marcus felt superior with his professional equipment. He had studied photography in college and considered himself an artist, not just another tourist, taking snapshots. As he photographed the guards, Marcus noticed how they never moved, never acknowledged the crowd, never even blinked as far as he could tell. It was impressive, but it also sparked something rebellious in his nature. Back home, Marcus was known for his pranks and his willingness to push boundaries for the sake of content. His most popular videos involved him doing outrageous things in public places, always walking the line between funny and inappropriate. The longer he watched the motionless guards, the more an idea began to form in his mind. What if he could get one of them to break character? What if he could create a moment that would go viral and boost his social media following? The thought excited him more than any standard tourist photo ever could. Marcus studied the guard closest to him, a tall soldier who looked to be in his early 30s. The man's face was stern, his posture perfect, and his uniform was absolutely pristine. The red wool tunic showed no wrinkles, the brass buttons gleamed in the sunlight, and even the white crossbelt across his chest appeared freshly cleaned that morning. Other tourists continued to take photos respectfully from behind the barriers, but Marcus found himself growing bored with the conventional approach. He wanted something different, something that would set his content apart from the thousands of other tourist photos flooding social media every day. The guard's proximity to the barrier gave Marcus an idea that made his pulse quicken with excitement. He looked around to see if anyone was watching him specifically, but the crowd was focused on the ceremony preparations. Security personnel were present, but they seemed more concerned with keeping people behind the barriers than monitoring individual behavior. Marcus checked his camera settings and switched to video mode. Whatever he was about to do, he wanted it recorded for his followers. The potential for viral content was too good to pass up, even if it meant bending a few rules. In his mind, he wasn't going to hurt anyone or damage anything important. He just wanted to create a memorable moment. As he positioned himself for the best angle, Marcus thought about all the successful content creators who had built their careers on bold, boundary-pushing stunts. They understood that sometimes you had to take risks to stand out in the crowded digital landscape. Playing it safe might keep you out of trouble, but it also kept you invisible. The guard remained motionless, unaware that he was about to become the unwilling star of what Marcus hoped would be his breakout viral moment. The American tourist's fingers trembled slightly with anticipation as he prepared to cross a line that thousands of respectful visitors managed to avoid every single day. Marcus told himself that royal guards probably dealt with difficult tourists all the time. Surely one small incident wouldn't be a big deal in the grand scheme of things. He convinced himself that he was just adding a little excitement to what was otherwise a pretty boring job of standing still for hours. The crowd around Him continued to grow as the ceremony time approached, providing perfect cover for what he was planning. Marcus took a deep breath, steadied his camera, and prepared to make his move. He had no idea that his next actions would trigger a chain of events that would teach him more about respect, consequence, and personal responsibility than any lecture ever could. The guard's uniform told a story of tradition, honor, and duty that stretched back centuries. Each element had meaning, from the specific shade of red that represented the blood spilled in defense of the crown to the precise positioning of every button and badge. But Marcus saw none of that history or significance. All he saw was an opportunity for content, a chance to create something that would get people talking and sharing. As tourists continued to arrive and the anticipation for the ceremony built around him, Marcus made his final preparations. He checked his phone battery, adjusted his camera angle one last time, and picked his moment. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave everyone involved changed, though Marcus had no way of knowing just how dramatically his life was about to shift. The moment came when the crowd's attention shifted toward the palace gates where the new guard was beginning to appear. Marcus saw his opportunity and acted without thinking through the consequences. He reached across the barrier with his free hand while holding his camera steady with the other and deliberately smeared his palm across the pristine white crossbelt of the guard's uniform. The reaction was immediate and shocking. The guard's head snapped toward Marcus with military precision, his eyes blazing with controlled fury. For a split second, Marcus felt a thrill of victory. He had gotten the reaction he wanted, and it was all being recorded. But that feeling lasted only until he saw the expression on the soldier's face. This wasn't the mild annoyance or embarrassment Marcus had expected. This was the look of a professional warrior who had just been personally insulted in front of hundreds of witnesses. The guard's jaw tightened, and though he couldn't abandon his post, his entire body radiated barely contained anger. Marcus quickly pulled his hand back and stepped away from the barrier, suddenly aware that he might have made a serious mistake. The dirty handprint on the white crossbelt stood out like a stain on fresh snow, visible to everyone in the immediate area. Other tourists began to notice what had happened, and their expressions ranged from shock to disgust. Within seconds, two security officers were pushing through the crowd toward Marcus. He tried to blend back into the group of tourists, but his professional camera equipment made him easy to spot. The officers reached him just as he was attempting to slip away toward the edge of the gathering. "Sir, we need you to come with us. Immediately," the first officer said in a tone that made it clear this wasn't a request. Marcus looked around desperately, hoping to find some way to explain or minimize what he had done. But the evidence was literally written across the guard's uniform for everyone to see. As the officers escorted him away from the crowd, Marcus could hear other tourists talking about what they had witnessed. Some were taking photos of the stained uniform, while others were shaking their heads in disapproval. The very content creation that Marcus had hoped would make him famous was now working against him, as dozens of people documented his humiliation. Tecker. Security officers led him to a small building adjacent to the palace grounds. Inside, Marcus found himself in a sterile room with fluorescent lighting and government-issued furniture that screamed official business. The reality of his situation began to sink in as he realized this wasn't going to be a simple warning and release. "Do you understand what you've just done?" asked the senior officer, a woman in her 40s with the kind of authoritative presence that came from years of dealing with difficult people. Marcus opened his mouth to offer an explanation, but she held up her hand to stop him. "You have defaced the uniform of a serving member of Her Majesty's Guard during an official ceremony. This isn't a prank or a joke. This is a serious offense that carries real consequences," she continued, her voice remaining professional but stern. Marcus felt his stomach drop. In all his planning for viral content, he had never considered that touching a guard's uniform might be treated as something more serious than a tourist mishap. He had imagined getting scolded, maybe asked to leave, but nothing that would involve official proceedings. The officer continued to explain the situation, while her colleague documented everything Marcus had with him, including his camera and phone. They informed him that the incident had been recorded by multiple security cameras, as well as by numerous tourists, so there was no question about what had happened or who was responsible. As Marcus sat in the uncomfortable chair, he began to realize how much trouble he was actually in. The officers mentioned words like prosecution, court appearance, and permanent record that made his heart race with panic. This wasn't the kind of attention he had wanted at all. The guard whose uniform he had defaced was brought in to provide his statement about the incident. Up close, without the ceremonial distance, the man was even more intimidating than Marcus had realized. He was clearly a career soldier, with the kind of physical conditioning and mental discipline that came from years of military service. "This uniform represents something bigger than myself," the guard said, his voice steady but filled with contained emotion. "When you put your hands on it, you weren't just touching fabric. You were disrespecting every soldier who has worn this uniform, every person who has died defending what it represents, and every family member who has sacrificed for our service." Marcus tried to interrupt with an apology, but the guard wasn't finished. "You came to our country as a guest, and you chose to treat our traditions and our service with contempt for your own entertainment. That shows me exactly what kind of person you are." The words hit harder than Marcus had expected. He had always thought of himself as a good person who just happened to push boundaries for fun. But hearing his actions described in terms of disrespect and contempt made him see the situation from a completely different angle. The processing continued for what felt like hours. Marcus had to provide his passport, his hotel information, and contact details for someone back home who could be reached in case of emergency. The seriousness of the official procedures made him realize that his European vacation had just taken a very dark turn. By the time the initial paperwork was complete, Marcus felt emotionally drained and physically exhausted. The excitement and confidence he had felt that morning seemed like memories from years ago rather than hours. He was beginning to understand that his quest for viral content had led him into a situation that was about to teach him lessons he had never wanted to learn. The next phase of Marcus's ordeal began when he was formally charged and given a court date 3 weeks away. This meant he couldn't simply return home to Denver and pretend the incident had never happened. He would have to remain in London, find accommodation, and face the legal consequences of his actions. The financial impact hit him immediately. His planned 2-week vacation had already stretched his budget to the limit, and now he faced weeks of unexpected expenses in one of the world's most expensive cities. The hotel room that had seemed like a reasonable splurge for a short stay became a crushing daily expense when multiplied by additional weeks. Marcus spent his first night after the incident in his hotel room, staring at his camera and phone, unable to bring himself to post anything to his social media accounts. His followers were expecting daily updates from London, but how could he explain that he was stuck there because of his own stupidity? The shame was almost overwhelming. By the second day, Marcus realized he needed to find cheaper accommodation if he was going to survive financially until his court date. He moved from his comfortable hotel to a cramped hostel room shared with 3 other travelers who couldn't understand why an American tourist would be staying in London for so long. The hostel was located in a rough part of the city, far from the tourist attractions that had originally drawn him to London. His roommates were budget travelers from various countries, most of them young people taking gap years or working temporary jobs to fund their adventures. They had very little money, but they seemed happier and more fulfilled than Marcus felt, despite his expensive camera equipment and social media following. As the days passed, Marcus began to realize how isolated he had become. His friends back home gradually stopped responding to his messages when he couldn't explain why his trip had been extended indefinitely. His social media accounts, which he had built up over years of constant posting, began to lose followers. as he went silent for the first time in his adult life. The worst part was the waiting. Marcus had never been good at sitting still, and now he found himself with nothing to do but think about his situation and worry about the upcoming court appearance. He couldn't enjoy London's attractions because every tourist site reminded him of why he was stuck there in the first place. During his third week in the hostel, Marcus struck up a conversation with one of his roommates, a young British man named James, who was between jobs and staying in London while he looked for work. James had heard about the incident through local news reports and recognized Marcus from the photos that had circulated online. "You're the American who touched the guard's uniform," James said matter-of-factly during one of their late-night conversations. Marcus nodded, expecting judgment or mockery, but James surprised him with a thoughtful response. "My grandfather was in the same regiment," James explained. "He served for 20 years, including 2 tours in Afghanistan. Those uniforms mean everything to the men who wear them. It's not just clothing, it's their identity, their history, their honor." This conversation led to others, and gradually Marcus began to understand the depth of what he had done. James explained the tradition and significance behind the ceremony, the years of training required to become a royal guard, and the personal sacrifices made by the soldiers and their families. "The guard you touched probably spent months preparing for that posting," James told him. "It's considered one of the highest honors in the British Army. When you put your hands on his uniform, you were literally touching the symbol of everything he's worked for." Marcus found himself crying that night for the first time since he was a child. The weight of his actions, combined with the stress of his situation and the financial pressure he was under, finally broke through his defenses. He realized that he had spent so many years focused on getting attention and creating content that he had lost sight of basic human decency and respect. The next morning, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He walked to the nearest library and began researching the history of the Royal Guards, the significance of their uniforms, and the traditions he had so carelessly violated. For the first time in years, he was learning something not to create content or impress others, but simply to understand and grow as a person. As his court date approached, Marcus also began volunteering at a local charity that helped homeless veterans. James had suggested it as a way to understand what military service meant to the people who chose it as their calling. Working with former soldiers who struggled with civilian life gave Marcus a completely new perspective on honor, sacrifice, and service. The veterans he worked with came from different backgrounds and had served in various conflicts, but they all shared a common bond of having given years of their lives to something larger than themselves. Many of them had physical or emotional scars from their service, yet they spoke about their time in the military with pride and dignity that Marcus had never encountered before. One veteran, a woman named Sarah who had lost her leg in Iraq, became particularly important in helping Marcus understand his mistake. She explained how military uniforms represent not just the individual wearing them, but the entire chain of service members who came before and would come after. "When you disrespected that guard's uniform, you disrespected everyone who ever wore it," Sarah told him gently but firmly. "That includes people who died wearing it, people who were wounded wearing it, and people who served their country with honor wearing it." These conversations and experiences began to change Marcus in ways he hadn't expected. The selfish, attention-seeking person who had arrived in London was slowly being replaced by someone who was beginning to understand concepts like respect, consequence, and personal responsibility. The day before his court appearance, Marcus received an unexpected visitor at the hostel. James knocked on his door and told him that someone wanted to meet him downstairs in the common room. Marcus assumed it was another roommate or perhaps someone from the charity where he had been volunteering. But when he reached the ground floor, he was shocked to see the guard whose uniform he had defaced. The soldier was dressed in civilian clothes, but Marcus recognized him immediately. The man's posture and bearing were unmistakable, even without his ceremonial uniform. Marcus felt his heart race with anxiety and shame as he approached, unsure of what to expect from this encounter. "My name is Sergeant William Davies," the guard said, extending his hand in a gesture that caught Marcus completely off guard. "I wanted to speak with you before tomorrow's court hearing." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that spoke of military training and personal confidence. Sergeant Davies suggested they sit at one of the tables in the hostel's small cafe area, away from the other residents who were watching the unusual meeting with curiosity. "I've been following what you've been doing these past few weeks," Sergeant Davies began, his voice carrying the same authority Marcus remembered from their first encounter, but without the anger that had been present that day. "The people at the Veterans Charity speak very highly of your work there." Marcus was stunned. He had assumed that the guard would want nothing to do with him except to see him punished to the full extent of the law. The idea that Sergeant Davies had been keeping track of his activities was both surprising and deeply unsettling. "I need to understand something," the sergeant continued. "When you put your hand on my uniform that day, what were you thinking? What did you hope to accomplish?" The directness of the question forced Marcus to confront his motivations in a way he had been avoiding for weeks. He could have offered excuses or tried to minimize his actions, but something about Sergeant Davies's straightforward approach demanded honesty in return. "I wanted to create content for social media," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to get a reaction that would make people share the video and increase my following. I never thought about what it meant to you or what your uniform represented." Sergeant Davies nodded slowly, as if Marcus's answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "That's what I thought. You saw me as a prop in your performance, not as a person with feelings, dignity, and a job to do." The words stung because they were absolutely true. Marcus had reduced this accomplished soldier to nothing more than a potential viral moment, without considering his humanity or the significance of what he represented. "I've served in the British Army for 12 years, Sergeant Davies continued. "I've done 3 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and countless other deployments around the world. I've seen friends die. I've been wounded myself, and I've spent years away from my family in service to my country." Marcus listened in silence, beginning to understand the depth of experience and sacrifice that stood behind the ceremonial role he had witnessed that day at the palace. "The uniform you touched represents all of that," the sergeant explained. "It represents every soldier who came before me, everyone who will come after me, and everyone who has made the ultimate sacrifice while wearing it. When you put your hands on it for entertainment, you were touching something sacred." The word sacred hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had never thought of anything in his life as sacred, and certainly hadn't considered that his actions might be violating something that held such deep meaning for another person. Sergeant Davies reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. It showed him in dress uniform, standing next to an older man who bore a strong family resemblance. "This is my father," he explained. "He served in the same regiment for 25 years. He was wounded in the Falklands War and received multiple commendations for bravery under fire." Marcus studied the photograph, seeing for the first time the generational aspect of military service that he had never considered. This wasn't just about one soldier's career, but about family traditions and inherited values that stretched across decades. "My son is 8 years old," Sergeant Davies continued, showing another photo of a young boy in a junior military cadet uniform. "He wants to follow in our footsteps and serve his country when he grows up. What you did that day wasn't just an insult to me personally, it was a degradation of something I hope to pass on to him." This revelation made Marcus feel even worse than he already had. His thoughtless action hadn't just affected one person, but had rippled out to impact a family's military tradition and a child's aspirations. "But I'm not here to make you feel worse than you already do," Sergeant Davies said, his tone softening slightly. "I'm here because I believe people can change, and I want to give you an opportunity to make this right." Marcus looked up with surprise and hope. Throughout the weeks of waiting for his court date, he had assumed that his fate was sealed and that nothing he could do would change the outcome or repair the damage he had caused. Sergeant Davies explained that he had spoken with his commanding officer and the court officials about Marcus's behavior over the past few weeks. The Veterans Charity had provided glowing reports about Marcus's dedication and genuine desire to understand military service. Several veterans had specifically mentioned how Marcus had listened to their stories with respect and had worked tirelessly to help with various programs. "I'm not going to ask the court to dismiss the charges," Sergeant Davies said clearly. "What you did was wrong, and there need to be consequences. But I am willing to speak on your behalf about the changes you've made and the genuine remorse you've shown." Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. After weeks of feeling hopeless and ashamed, this unexpected gesture of potential forgiveness was overwhelming. But Sergeant Davies wasn't finished. "However, I want something from you in return," he continued. "I want you to understand that forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and redemption requires ongoing commitment, not just temporary good behavior." The sergeant proposed that if Marcus was willing, they could work together on a project that would turn his mistake into something positive. He explained that the regiment often struggled to connect with younger people who didn't understand military service or appreciate its significance. "You understand social media and digital communication in ways that most of us don't," Sergeant Davies acknowledged. "If you're genuinely sorry for what you did, you could use those skills to educate people instead of just entertaining them." The idea was both appealing and terrifying to Marcus. It would mean admitting his mistake publicly and using his platform to promote something other than himself. But it also offered him a chance to create meaningful content for the first time in his life. They spent the next several hours discussing the details of what such a project might look like. Sergeant Davies suggested that Marcus could create educational content about military history, the significance of ceremonial duties, and the real stories of people who served. It would be a complete departure from the shallow, attention-seeking content that had built his following. "The question is whether you're willing to risk losing followers in order to gain something more valuable," Sergeant Davies challenged him. "Are you ready to use your platform for something that matters, even if it's not as popular as your previous content?" Marcus spent that night thinking about the sergeant's proposal. He realized that he was being offered something he had never had before, a chance to create content that would actually help people understand something important, rather than just seeking clicks and shares. The next morning, Marcus walked into the courthouse with Sergeant Davies beside him. The experience of facing a judge was humbling and frightening, but having the guard there as a character witness made an enormous difference in both the proceedings and Marcus's own confidence. The judge listened carefully to both sides of the case. The prosecution outlined the seriousness of Marcus's actions and the disrespect shown to British military traditions. They presented evidence from multiple cameras and witness statements that left no doubt about what had happened. When it came time for character references, Sergeant Davies stood and spoke about Marcus's behavior over the past few weeks. He described the genuine remorse Marcus had shown, his volunteer work with veterans, and his apparent commitment to understanding what he had done wrong. "Your Honor," Sergeant Davies said, "I believe this young man has learned from his mistake and is committed to making amends. While I cannot excuse his actions, I can testify to his character and his potential for positive contribution going forward." The judge also heard from Sarah, the veteran Marcus had worked with at the charity, and from James, his hostile roommate who had helped educate him about British military traditions. Each testimony painted a picture of someone who had genuinely changed over the course of his extended stay in London. Marcus was given the opportunity to speak on his own behalf. Standing before the judge, he found himself thinking about all the conversations he had had over the past few weeks, all the stories he had heard from veterans, and all the shame he had felt about his actions. "Your Honor, I can't undo what I did," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "But I can commit to spending the rest of my life making sure that other people don't make the same mistake I did. I want to use my platform to educate people about the significance of military service and the respect that our soldiers deserve." The judge's sentence reflected both the seriousness of the offense and the mitigation provided by Marcus's behavior since the incident. He received a substantial fine, community service hours to be completed with military-related charities, and a permanent ban from participating in any official ceremonies involving the royal family. More importantly to Marcus, the judge also ordered him to create and maintain educational content about military service and British history for a period of 2 years, with regular reviews to ensure compliance. This meant that his collaboration with Sergeant Davies would have official backing and oversight. Walking out of the courthouse, Marcus felt a mixture of relief, gratitude, and determination. The legal consequences were serious, but they were also manageable, and they came with an opportunity to transform his mistake into something meaningful. 6 months after returning to Denver, Marcus had completely transformed his online presence and his approach to content creation. Working closely with Sergeant Davies through video calls and email, he had developed a series of educational videos about military history, the significance of ceremonial duties, and the personal stories of service members from around the world. The response from his audience had been mixed initially. Many of his original followers, who had expected pranks and boundary-pushing content, gradually drifted away when Marcus shifted to more serious subject matter. But he was surprised to discover that the content attracted a new type of follower, people who were genuinely interested in learning and understanding rather than just being entertained. His first major project was a detailed explanation of the changing of the guard ceremony, created in collaboration with Sergeant Davies and several other members of the regiment. The video included historical background, interviews with current and former guards, and a heartfelt apology from Marcus about his own behavior during his visit to London. The video went viral, but not in the way Marcus's previous content had. Instead of being shared for shock value or entertainment, it was shared by educators, veterans organizations, and people who appreciated learning something new. Comments came from teachers who used it in history classes, from veterans who felt their service was finally being properly explained to younger generations, and from tourists who said it helped them understand what they were witnessing during their own visits to London. Marcus also began featuring stories from local veterans in Denver, giving them a platform to share their experiences and educate the public about military service. These interviews became some of his most popular content, as viewers connected with the personal stories and human experiences behind the uniforms and ceremonies. The financial aspect of his content creation changed dramatically as well. While his overall follower count had initially decreased, the engagement rates were much higher because his audience was genuinely interested in the material. This attracted sponsors and partners who valued educational content over viral entertainment, leading to more stable and sustainable income than his previous approach had provided. More importantly to Marcus, he found himself genuinely passionate about his work for the first time in his life. Instead of constantly searching for the next attention-grabbing stunt, he was focused on research, storytelling, and creating content that had lasting value. The process of learning about military history and interviewing veterans had become personally fulfilling in ways that his previous content creation never had been. His relationship with Sergeant Davies evolved into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The sergeant visited Denver on leave and met Marcus's family, helping them understand the transformation their son had undergone during his extended time in London. Marcus, in turn, had saved money to visit London again, this time as a respectful tourist who participated in remembrance ceremonies and volunteered with veteran organizations. The most significant change, however, was in Marcus himself. The self-centered, attention-seeking person who had defaced a Royal Guards uniform had been replaced by someone who understood concepts like honor, respect, and service to others. His social media profiles now featured his volunteer work, his educational initiatives, and his ongoing commitment to veteran causes. Marcus also began speaking at schools and universities about his experience, using his mistake as a teaching tool to help young people understand the importance of thinking, before acting and considering the impact of their behavior on others. These presentations were often emotional, as Marcus had to repeatedly confront his past behavior and the hurt he had caused. But they were also powerful in their ability to prevent others from making similar mistakes. The court-ordered community service had initially felt like a punishment, but it had become one of the most rewarding aspects of Marcus's life. He continued volunteering with veteran organizations long after his required hours were completed, finding that the relationships he had built and the work he was doing provided more satisfaction than any viral video ever had. 2 years after the incident, Marcus received a letter from Sergeant Davies informing him that his court-ordered educational content requirement had been successfully completed. The judge had reviewed his work and determined that he had exceeded expectations in both quantity and quality of educational material produced. But Marcus had no intention of stopping. The work had become his calling, and he had discovered that using his platform to educate and inspire others was far more fulfilling than using it for personal attention had ever been. Looking back on that day at Buckingham Palace, Marcus realized that his moment of stupidity had accidentally led him to discover his life's purpose. The painful lesson he had been taught through legal consequences, public shame, and financial hardship had ultimately guided him toward becoming a better person and finding meaningful work that contributed positively to the world. The tourist, who had defaced a Royal Guards uniform in search of viral fame, was gone, replaced by an educator and advocate who understood that true success came not from getting attention, but from earning respect through service to others.